Glenn Silverman and Chris Hart's 10-day research trip to India in November last year took them to Bangalore, New Delhi and Mumbai, where they met various stakeholders in sectors such as infrastructure, financial services and investment industries. They also met the leaders of multinational organizations, key government officials, policymakers and macroeconomic experts.
There are 66 different Indian companies in South Africa already. That's a big number. So already that's a lot, and there are a lot of South African companies in India. I was amazed there to see how long they've been there. We mentioned Old Mutual, SA Brewery's been there since 2001. Talking about 12 years. So there's actually been quite a lot of interaction, and I think that makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of kind of historical links between the two countries, and it's a country that we thought was actually very easy to do business in.
South Africa will host the 5th BRICS Summit at the end of March at the Durban International Convention Centre. This will complete the first cycle of BRICS summits.
One of the important roles South Africa can bring is that it brings a small voice but a unifying voice, because there's no natural unity between the BRIC bloc as such.
According to the World Bank, India's GDP rose 1.3% to $1.7 trillion in 2012. This makes India the second largest member state within the BRICS bloc. Trade activity between India and South Africa has soared over the years and is expected to reach $15 billion by 2014. However, as an investment company, Investment Solutions is not rushing into doing business in India.
I don't think there's a specific opportunity to us. Would I love to go and create a business at some point in time in India? Probably. I think there's an opportunity. But we're pretty fully occupied in the things we see in South Africa. We think there's opportunity in Africa. So I think before we start rushing off to solve and sort out things that are happening in India, we'll probably start with closer to home first.
When BRICS are mentioned, China tends to be the main focus due to the size of its economy and its emergence as a superpower within the global arena.
There's going to be two major potential players to grab that mantle. Everyone talks about China because it's the world's largest economy, it's very powerful, it's grown very strong for a long period of time. Far few people talk about India, and I think that's wrong. I think India is the world's largest democracy, many times larger than, for example, America. I think could easily claim that mantle. Now in 15 years' time, India is going to have a larger population in China, and I think that augments the story. So if I were a betting man, I think I might put my money on India.
India's connections with South Africa are strong and transcend cold economics. This is largely due to a presence of about 1 million South African Indians, many of whom retain ties with their homeland.
Our infrastructure in this country is phenomenal. They're very infrastructure constrained. It was, traveling there was a nightmare. That's not the case in South Africa. But I also pointed out other things in the presentation. We need to get our education right. The number of engineers we produce in the country is too low. The standard of maths and science too low.
India already went into a period of decline and is now back into a period of ascendancy. And in terms of that, Africa's never really had that economic dominance over the rest of the world as such. And so any economic growth to a point in Africa will be, you could say, almost a new experience.
Okay, Glenn, great, fantastic to have you on the show again. I know you joined us, I think, towards the end of last year, and we spoke a little bit about these trips that you've embarked on as part of your study, I guess, to just understand the BRICS phenomenon a little bit better. Just from your perspective as the Chief Investment Officer of Investment Solutions, you're traveling to these countries with a couple of reasons and a specific purpose. What is that?
So the first one is this whole concept of BRICS is very interesting because everyone thinks they know it because they know the acronym, myself included: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and what we call the smaller S, South Africa, because we just don't have the population quite that they have. And Jim O'Neill, who's the guy who coined the phrase, didn't have the S there. He didn't have South Africa involved there. So emerging market, the BRICS are very important in the world, a source of most of the world's growth, most of the world's population, most of the world's land mass, and so a really important part of the world. You can access them kind of two ways. You either buy a big developed market company like Nestle or Unilever and they invest into emerging markets, or more directly in emerging markets themselves. So our focus is the latter. to try and understand what's happening on the ground in those different countries and what are the implications for South Africa, the lessons, the similarities and the differences.
I think one of the things that you've reported back to your clients and investors is the fact that these countries, while they are grouped now together, they are very complex and very different from one another. You returned recently from a trip to Brazil as well, and for comparison purposes now with India, you kind of did some analysis around comparing Africa as a whole with India. What just in terms of some of the findings that you've come from in terms of the travels to Brazil and India, what are some of the nuances that people forget and that maybe don't know in regard to those two countries in particular?
So again, first thing is walking the streets, smelling the air, tasting the food, meeting with people on the ground gives you insight that you would never get on the internet or reading a newspaper, etc. So that's been absolutely fascinating. The two countries we've seen thus far, Brazil and India, are very, very different. When we came back from Brazil, we said the following. It's a very large country. It's about 90% of the size of North America. Well over 200 million people in terms of population. And it's very secluded. They speak their own language, which is different to what is spoken in the rest of South America. And you know, if you think about, for example, in Africa, Mozambique, Angola is where they have an interest because of the common language connection, etc. We saw very little evidence of South African companies there. We've seen very little evidence of Brazilian companies in South Africa. It's not to say it's not happening, but much less than, for example, when we come to India. It felt quite foreign. English is their second language, taught at schools, but it was very difficult to converse. Very different to India. Obviously, they speak particularly well. And you just got a sense of a country that was very inward-looking, very protectionist. We spoke to companies, etc. Everything was about trade barriers and how the government is protecting the local industry. One got a pretty different sense when you went to somewhere like India.
Just in terms of India, and that's really where we want to focus our attention on the show tonight, a massive country in terms of population. Within the country itself, various different cultures and obviously attitudes to both inward investment by foreign investors as well as their own concept. You came up with a couple of interesting findings there, and I just wanted to ask you specifically, is it a country that's easy for an outside investor to get involved in at this point?
It was interesting that India is made up of 28 different states, and each of them are pretty different. The analogy that we draw is it's more similar to Africa. If you say you have an African strategy, I would question that very hard. I think you can have a specific country strategy within Africa. You might have a Nigeria strategy and a Ghana strategy and a Kenya strategy, but not a pan-Africa strategy. I think that'd be difficult. And we found the same thing in India. Each state is so different in terms of rules, regulation, ethnicity, language, culture differences, etc., that even Indian companies, there were very, very few examples of one that had a kind of a pan-India exposure. So there are some 66 Indian companies in South Africa. That surprised me. That's a lot of companies. Names you're very familiar with, Tatas and Mahindras, etc. And in India, we don't know exactly the number, but there's been companies that have been there for a very long time, well over a decade, etc. And I don't know specifically. I think it's industry by industry in terms of how difficult it is and isn't to get into. It also differs state by state. The Indian states are competing with one another to try and give incentives to companies to come in. I would say that from a government perspective, they are quite loath to just let big foreigners in. So you get some sense of a protection of the economy as well.
In terms of a coherent strategy, we know we're quite familiar, or many people are familiar with the idea that the Chinese government wanted to build the physical infrastructure and lead the economy growth through export and manufacturing. What's the sort of sense in India? Is there a coherent strategy around what they're trying to achieve economically from the government's perspective? We know that they're very big in services, for instance, and IT. And there's some other industries like Bollywood, I think that you pointed out, that are very large. But is there kind of an underlying coherent strategy in terms of what they're trying to achieve there?
I think if you contrast it to China, which we haven't been, and that's the next trip that we're going to, I get a sense that that is much more strategic command economy dictated as to kind of how they're going to run the economy. I got much less sense of that in terms of India. Huge, tens of thousands of small and medium enterprise, very entrepreneurial. They will try anything, anywhere and everywhere. It was a fascinating thing to speak to Indian corporates and to say, why haven't you gone and expanded into your neighboring states within India? Why are you in Africa, North America, even in the UK? I found that very, very surprising. And there seems to be a very strong drive to do so. They wanted some money outside the country. They wanted, I think, to get away from some of the, the stronghold that the government used to have, certainly under what they called the license Raj. They used to control that economy very, very tightly. In 1979, Indira Gandhi nationalized most parts of the economy. And I think they still remember this, and so there's a desire to expand out of there. But it's a complex place. National scars, national priorities, start of the value chain were discussions that we had with them. Where does it all start? So IT services are now the biggest part of the economy, and yet our sense is that agriculture is probably much more important. Some 2/3 of the population still live in the rural area. If the monsoons don't come, the rains don't come, they have a real problem. They've had major famines in the past where they had to import food into India. This left a scar on them. So they have different priorities to the Chinese, most certainly. And it's certainly not about infrastructure. The infrastructure there is very constrained.
In terms of the relative wealth and the different measures that we look at to try and assess, how a consumer economy would work there, we look at things like you pointed out, the Gini coefficient, the amount of people that are employed. Just sketch that out for people that are aware that obviously India is one of the largest, most populous countries with over 1 billion people. But what's the sort of makeup of that workforce?
So it's fascinating to us. What we really struggled with was the disconnect between bottom-up, corporates, which were amazing, and the top-down numbers, which didn't make any sense. One example of that is Indian unemployment officially is running at 4%. Doesn't make sense. We looked at poverty levels. The World Bank defined extreme poverty below $1.25 per day. There are 404 odd Indians living below that level. So their definition of employment is if you're doing anything and earning any income and trying to find work, you're employed. But there's a huge number of poverty-stricken people in the economy. So the stats were very, very difficult. When you wanted to understand unemployment, South Africa has a 25% unemployment rate. They supposedly have 4%. But those numbers also change. They're not consistent. So the macro numbers, I felt we needed to treat with a little bit of skepticism. And I think that's why, again, going almost city by city with the 4 places that we went to, etc., and speaking to tens of companies and some government officials as well, probably gave better insight.
And that's always to bear in mind. That's the first of the interview with Glenn Silverman, Chief Investment Officer of Investment Solutions. Stay tuned because we'll be back.